Okay. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. When I was supreme amongst humans, you were born on this earth, you paced out 7 strides and said, I am supreme in this world. To you who are wise, then I prostrate. With form bodies, forms supremely pure, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain, fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best, Lord, to you I prostrate. With the supreme signs, face like spotless moon, color like gold, to you I prostrate. Dust free like you, the 3 worlds are not, incomparably wise one, to you I prostrate. The Savior having great compassion, the Founder having all understanding, the field of merit with qualities like a vast ocean, to you, while the one gone the thusness, I prostrate. The purity that frees one from attachment, the virtue that frees one from the lower realms, the one path, sublime pure reality, to the Dharma that pacifies, I prostrate. Those who are liberated and also show the path to liberation, the holy field qualified with realizations, to you who are devoted to the moral precepts, to you, sublime community intending virtue, I prostrate. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all 3 have heard devout homage. With to all worthy of respect, bowing with the bodies as many as all realms, atoms, and all aspects, with supreme faith I pay homage. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind thoroughly, this is the teaching of the Buddha. A star is an elaboration, a flame of a lamp, illusion, a drop of dew or a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud. See conditioned things as such. Through these merits may sentient beings attain the rank of all seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. I prostrate to the Arya Triple Gem. Thus did I hear at one time, the Bhagavan was dwelling in the vast Vulture's mountain, in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagavan was absorbed in the concentration of the profound perfection of wisdom, in the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom, and beheld those 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then, through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara: how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, in the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Shariputra: Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch. There is no I element and so on up to including no mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on up to it, including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, station, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell on the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration, without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the endpoint of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly completely awakened to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment and reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the mantra, unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled. The mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering should be known as a truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared, Tayata Om Gate Gate Parasam Gate Bodhi Soham. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, to train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. And the Bhagavan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage, it is like that. It is like that one should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated, even that Haratakaras rejoice. The Bhagavan having thus spoken, the Venerable Shardadaputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, and those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, are overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagavan. Tayata Om Gate Gate Paragate Parasam Gate Bodhi Soham.
This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, four continents, the sun and the moon, I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. O holy, perfect, pure Lama from the clouds of compassion that form in the skies of your Dharmakaya wisdom, please release a rain of vast and profound Dharma, precisely in accordance with the needs of those to be trained. Idam Kuru Ratnam Mandalakam Niryatayami.
I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. The merits I create through teaching the Dharma may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. The merits I create through teaching the Dharma may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. The merits I create through teaching the Dharma may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Okay, so again, welcome everybody, and let's just start by sitting quietly together for a couple of minutes. Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. We're in the third week here of teachings, and so I was looking over the slides this morning. I think we'll probably be able to finish tomorrow. There's a lot of verses left, but there's not as many slides left because from here on, it's mainly just explaining the text. There aren't any digressions left. But of course, if there's important things to talk about, I'll bring them up. And tomorrow, if we finish tomorrow, at the end of the text, I'll of course mention other, kind of bringing it back to all the themes we've talked about. So one thing I also thought to bring up now, because it relates to some of the questions people had been asking, and also I think it's an important thing to keep emphasizing, is that this is a text on the wisdom side of the path. But of course, that needs to be grounded in the practice as well, which is the merit side, accumulating merit, practicing meditation, working with one's own mind. And sometimes people ask, why is this necessary? Why is the wisdom side necessary so much? That, I like Buddhism because it gives me an ethical framework, it gives me a way to work with my mind, practice meditation. Why do I need to think so much about all these philosophical concepts? Isn't that even contrary to the Buddha's teaching, that you don't want to get too abstract, and it's better to focus on your suffering now and what are the causes of that? So, one thing I'd say to that is, if our goal is just to have a little more peace in our lives, so we think, okay, my life is stressful. I'd like to do some meditation every day to reduce stress. I'd like to have better relations with people I know, not get angry so much. Then maybe it's not so necessary to go so deeply. It can be helpful just to do some basic mindfulness meditation, and that can help with those things. But the Buddha definitely talked about enlightenment. This is something that even some people today who consider themselves Buddhist claim that they don't believe in enlightenment, that they think that this is just an Indian concept and that people projected this onto the Buddha. But there's no such thing as this enlightenment in the traditional sense of somebody achieving almost non-human states or supernatural states, as would be seen by a lot of people. And so I think that's where, if we really want to examine, is there such a thing as enlightenment, it's going to eventually conflict with some of the worldviews we hold. And so we have to think about those. We have to question, is it true? This is the worldviews we hold, or are they just assumptions? Are they something that we actually have proven? So some of us might go the other direction and not really, we might, for example, be very impressed by our teachers. We have like His Holiness Dalai Lama, or within FPMT, Lama Yeshe, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, or other great teachers you might have. We might think this person is amazing. They must be enlightened. And that is useful. I mean, it's a useful experience to see that, okay, this isn't just talk, that there are people who seem to manifest these qualities. But I think that only lasts for a certain time. It's been my experience from observing other people, and myself, of course, too. I've seen a lot of people ordain as monks and nuns and then later leave, or just people who get interested in Buddhism, and at first it's very, very enthusiastic, but later that wanes and they just disappear from the Buddhist community. And I think a lot of what happens there, it's not always the case. There are many different reasons, but one thing certainly is that with what we call suspension of doubt, that there's a sense that, wow, this makes so much sense. Of course, it contradicts all these things that I was raised to assume about the world. But let's just put that aside for now. It's a suspension of doubt. Let's not worry about it. I'll check. I'm going to just keep going with this, because I think if I do this for a while, if I keep practicing Buddhism, maybe I'll be enlightened in 10 years and then I'll understand. But at a certain point, you're left with the initial excitement wears off, and I'm basically the same person. I haven't seen some enormous change in myself. So then the doubt can start to come back. Maybe I was just, a new convert, and maybe it was all just, enthusiasm. Maybe there isn't really something, more possible that I can do with myself, that I can change myself. May not even consciously think that. It's just kind of that creeping doubt in the mind. And so that is obviously a major obstacle, not just to staying within Buddhism, but even if someone does stay, to really advancing. And so that's why it's really important to develop wisdom and to really think about these things. And so the text that we're discussing in Nagarjuna's Dispelling Disputes is an argument with an opponent who's criticizing the Buddhist viewpoint. Now, this opponent, it seems, is definitely what we call an eternalist or a reificationist, somebody who thinks that there's something much more real behind the everyday world of appearances. That when we talk about things, for example, that our words refer to inherently real things that are beyond our concepts of them. So actually, most people don't hold that view these days. That was a very common view. Maybe perhaps before a scientific period, in the age of science, because there was so much unexplained in the world that it was assumed it must be created by somebody or by some kind of organizing system. And now science has explained a great deal, certainly not everything, but a lot of things that were mysterious are now been explained. So it tends to go the other way. People tend to, especially who are raised in a strong scientific background, tend to have the other extreme of thinking that everything is basically just material, and that our concepts really have no correspondence with any ultimate reality. It's just, everything is, as the common saying these days, you'll often see, that everything is ultimately meaningless. The universe really has no meaning. We might ascribe meaning to it, and we can live a meaningful life based on that. But ultimately, it has nothing to do with the way things really are. It's all just dead matter. And the consequence of that is that when we die, then our mind ceases to exist. The mind is just a product of the brain we talked about. So that is obviously, within that worldview, then there's not really any room for enlightenment. Now, of course, there are people who claim that there is. You'll see that there are a lot of people actually who get interested in Buddhism. And as I said, there's many different ways people can come to terms with this kind of incongruency. And one is just to leave and get disappointed. But one is therefore to try to reinterpret the teachings in light of materialism. And we see various authors who do this, who tried to say that actually the Buddha was a materialist. Some people even claim that, and that he didn't say it directly because, can you stay still? Okay, I'll try to stay still. So, there's some people who will say that the Buddha he didn't actually believe in this whole worldview of reincarnation and karma and gods in the sky and ghosts and so forth. It was just a skillful means to help people at the time. And actually, it seems that the only real reason to believe that is that we believe that. There's not really any evidence in the scriptures that the Buddha didn't believe these things, but if we take the assumption that these things are true and the Buddha was an intelligent person, then we might assume that he must have understood them. But again, this takes the presupposition that these things are true. But then within that, then there's the argument that, but the Buddha did teach a very good system for dealing with mental afflictions, which are essentially brain states, but they can still be modified with behavior and with meditation and so forth. So sometimes I mention, because I found this very ironic. There was a book written a few years ago. Some of you might know, I don't know, there's an author named Robert Wright, who's a quite popular science writer, not a scientist himself, but he's a writer about themes in science, especially the theme of evolutionary psychology, which is a particular way of interpreting psychology based on evolution. It's certainly not the only interpretation, It's actually somewhat controversial, but in any case, he's a promoter of this view. And he wrote a book called Why Buddhism Is True. So being interested to see what his arguments were, it seemed like the kind of thing that in our house here we would like to have in our library. So we ordered this book. So I opened the book, and the very first sentence was essentially, let me get one thing straight. This is not a book about those aspects of Buddhism, such as karma and reincarnation, which contradict science. This is a book about those parts of Buddhism that agree with science. So essentially what the author has just admitted in the first page, or the very first sentence of the book, is that Buddhism is not true, and that science is true. If Buddhism happens to say some things that correlate with science, then we can say Buddhism is true. But if it doesn't, then we can just reject those things. So we could actually say this about everything. Actually one author even mentioned, ironically, we could just call it Why Islam is True, or Why Christianity is True. And to say, well, this is the book about those parts of Christianity that correlate with science, but all those parts of Christianity like God that don't correlate with science, we reject. So you wouldn't really be left with a whole lot. Of course, there are people, I don't know if I've ever heard somebody say that specific sentence, but there are people who will argue, well, there's wonderful things about Christianity like community life and compassion and charity, and that's why I go to church, but I don't actually believe in God, which is perfectly fine. But there's a question here of, are you really, if you're going to say why Christianity is true, what are people going to think about that? What's conveyed? And it seems that I don't think anyone would write a book called Why Christianity is True and reject God, because there are many books about like the case for Christ, the case for faith, all kinds of books like these that obviously are trying to prove that this was a real thing, and whatever way they, whatever denomination they might approach it from. So if we want to say Buddhism is true, it seems to be that there's a bit of a double standard, that because Buddhism is seen as scientific, it seems that we can therefore just adopt the scientific aspects of it. But really, when this author is saying that if Buddhism accords with science, he's really talking about according with a worldview, because science is meant to be the objective study of things using the scientific method. It's a methodology, it's not a worldview per se. Whereas he's equating it specifically with the worldview, and mostly, at a broader level, materialism, but more specifically in his case, evolutionary psychology. So the rest of the book is really a book about evolutionary psychology, and then saying, well, it looks like the Buddha was also talking about this. And it's rather forced, and it gives the impression that the author really hasn't read a whole lot about Buddhism. But these are very common. We find these kinds of things a lot. That Buddhism is seen as the modern religion that fits with science, and then all those other extraneous things like karma, reincarnation, we can just throw away. But personally, even from an objective standpoint, I'm not just talking about my own, my own faith in Buddhism or my own emphasis in my own practice. But if we look at what the Buddha was saying, it seems like karma or reincarnation was really his central message. It was the most important aspect of his teaching, and the purpose of this was to be free of karma, reincarnation, and achieve enlightenment. The things that were more mundane, like dealing with kings and dealing with family issues, were clearly superfluous to his main message. They were kind of things he did on the side, but it wasn't like he just came, he didn't go around teaching mainly for the purpose of helping people have better family lives. So that was just if it happened to be that somebody wasn't in a position to ordain and practice full time and to understand the depth of his teaching, then he would give them advice on where they were. So the point I'm making, of course, is that if we really want to look deeply at what the Buddha was saying, then it's really important to question these things and have tools for questioning it. Again, some of us might feel that, well, science is so strong, it's explained so much, how could this ancient religion from 2,500 years ago have anything to say that would challenge that? And so that's really something worth pursuing. And I hope that some of what are the things I'm talking about, some of the topics I've brought up, I haven't gotten to a lot of things in great depth, but I hope that it at least gives some possibility of how we can start thinking about things in a different way. And is there a way to question this? I certainly do feel that Nagarjuna's philosophy, the other great Indian Panditas, that they had a way of understanding things that really is a challenge, a totally different way of approaching things. And I'll talk about that more, I think, tomorrow if we finish at the end, last talk. But also, just the different themes I've been covering show that there's a real challenge to materialism, both in terms of whether it philosophically is coherent, internally coherent, and also whether there is evidence against it, which a lot of these people who are scholars in India were also meditators and were having experiences that probably wouldn't fit into the current paradigm. So I won't go into a lot of those other details. Of course, if people are interested, please write to me. We have the email questions, and I'm happy to provide more resources on that. And also in the first course I gave a few months ago on Nagarjuna on 70 stanzas, at the introductory talk, I did talk more about some of the ways that Buddhism challenges current worldview and provides an alternative. But I think it's just something to keep in mind. As I said, this text, it may not really challenge a lot of the things we think, because a lot of us don't hold a reificationist worldview, unless some of you are very religious. But I doubt if you're already very strongly Christian or Muslim or Jewish, believing strongly in a monotheistic system, that you'd be attending the talk. But in any case, it's very useful to think about these things. And even if you are, even if people who are raised in those traditional religions also are exposed to science, so often there's a dichotomy, there's a bit of a tension. But it's useful to see how Nagarjuna argues against these different views. And then, as I say, tomorrow I'll talk more about how this also could be applied to the materialist view. So let's continue with the text. So I'm going to try something different today. So let's see. When we do the screen share, I'm going to try the slideshow for PowerPoint, because it makes the slides more clear. But it may be that I lose the ability to see you and communicate with you. So if you can't hear me or anything, just tell me, just say something. Or hopefully we can do like this. Okay, good. I can still see you, and you can all see the full screen, right?
Yep.
Okay, good. Okay, good. All right. Yeah, let me know if there's a problem at any point. So yeah, we left off here at the mouse poison analogy. This was the digression from this question of self-cognizers. So we were in the second debate about epistemology. How do we know what we know? And from that there came the question of, okay, if valid cognition is not, if valid cognition is what certifies its objects, the things to be known, then how do you certify valid cognition? So one answer was that it's certified by another valid cognition, but this had the problem of infinite regress, and also that one particular cognition is therefore more valid than the others, that you can rely on that one. So then the other possibility was that cognition verifies itself, like the example of the fire that illuminates itself. So this was all a digression from that first there were arguments against that example, saying that if fire illuminates itself, that's incoherent. For example, to illuminate something is a cause and effect relationship. There has to be something which is not illuminated and then becomes illuminated by the fire. It's not like fire exists in the dark and then comes along and illuminates itself. It's not a good analogy. And then there was then an argument directly against how if cognition cognizes itself, what problems come from that, what stem from that, and this is what this whole digression was about. So I won't go over that in detail again, but I hope there was some, it was probably a little bit confusing. Some of it's quite a deep argument. This is a major argument both within Buddhism and in ancient India among philosophers. But then, okay, so if cognition doesn't certify itself, is there another way it could be certified? So we come to another possibility here, that maybe the objects, it's certified by the object itself. Not like the object knows the cognition, that wouldn't make much sense. But that by knowing a correct object, then the cognition itself becomes a correct knower. So this is verse 43. So, or if relying they're established, what fault lies in accepting this? So this is the opponent coming back and saying, before we said, well, you said that valid cognizers establish themselves without relying on anything else, and that doesn't work. So now he says, okay, I admit they do rely on something else. They rely on their objects. The cognizer is established as valid in a relation to a correct object, not just in and of itself. It's not that its nature is validity, but it's a valid cognition in relation to the object. That's a correct object. So what fault lies in accepting this? So Nagarjuna says, what's unestablished can't rely. You verify what's verified. So here we have the opponent saying, okay, I accept. Valid cognizers do rely on their objects to be established. But then Nagarjuna responds to that, but if the objects are already established, they must have been established by valid cognizers. So those are already established too. So it again becomes in a kind of infinite regress. That if you say, well, this cognition is valid because that object that it sees is valid, well, how do you know the object is valid? It must have been established by some valid cognizer. If it's established by a different valid cognizer, then you have to establish that one. You have this infinite regress. Or if it's established by the current one that I'm trying to establish, then I've already established it. If I say, for example, mind A is correct because it realizes object A. Well, how do I know object A is correct? Because I could say, well, because mind B establishes it. Or I could say, well, I know it's correct because mind A establishes it. But then it becomes circular. Well, then mind A must have already been understood to be correct because it's what's certifying that object A is correct. So it's more clear in verse 44. If valid minds are always proved relying on their objects, then the object thus are verified without relying on the minds. So either it's the case that the object is verified by the mind, in which case you don't need to verify the mind because you already know it's veridical, or the object is just naturally valid without relying on any mind to verify it. So how does that work? How can we have an object that simply by seeing it, you know that it's true? Simply by having it appear to your mind, you know that it's true without having to rely on any kind of analysis to determine that. So next we have if objects verified minds. So what if the object itself verifies that the mind is valid? So then if objects thus are verified without relying on the minds, what point for you to verify those minds? What's left for them to prove? So our purpose here is to verify that my mind is valid by saying that the object it's realizing is valid. So first I say the object is valid, so therefore I know that my mind is valid. But then the whole purpose of verifying that my mind is valid is that I can therefore judge that the object I'm seeing is correctly perceived. But if I already know a priori that the object is valid, there's no point, there's no need for me to verify whether my mind is correct or not. So it just becomes, what's left for them to prove? The object is already proved. There's no more purpose for having a mind. But if valid minds are verified relying on their objects, then it's certainly the case for you that minds and objects are reversed. So first we've come to the question of how do we know that things are real? And we say, well, they're verified by the mind. But now I've come to the other extreme. I'm saying, how do I know my mind is real? Because it's verified by the objects. So it's making it sound like the object is the thing establishing the mind, as the object somehow realizes the mind and makes the mind true. So they're reversed. The objects become the minds, and the minds become the objects. So then what if there's mutual establishment? What if they establish each other? Or if by proving valid minds, you verify their objects too, and by the objects prove the minds, then neither one is proved for you. So really, if they prove each other, neither one is proved, because they have to rely on each other to prove each other. So unless one is proved, the other's not proved, but one can't be proved before the other one because they have to be at the same time. So it's like this below, we have the tripod. The three legs of a tripod support each other. This is an argument actually that some Buddhist schools make. Some of the lower Buddhist schools claim that cause and effect can be mutually establishing, that something can be mutually cause and effect. Something can be the cause of one thing, and the effect can also be the cause of the cause, like a tripod, where each thing, in order to stand up, they both have to be standing up. But this is problematic, according to Buddhist philosophy of the other schools, that cause and effect necessarily have to be temporal, that the cause has to exist before the effect. If they exist at the same time, then when would they start? If object B comes into existence when object A comes into existence, and object A comes into existence when object B comes into existence, when do they start? Neither one will ever come about because they rely on each other, and neither one of them is there before the other one. So likewise, if the two things prove each other, neither one of them is proved because one has to be proved before the other to prove the second one. So then he just goes on with this either possibility. If valid knowers verify their objects, and their objects too, establish them as valid minds, how do they establish them? So if there's a problem, if valid minds verify the objects, but then the objects also verify the minds, how do the objects verify the minds? Or if objects known establish minds, and valid knowers verify the objects that they recognize, how is it that they verify? It's the same problem. If they're mutually supportive, how do they do that? It's not like you can't have two people. A good example would be you can't have two people pick each other up, right? I can pick you up, you can pick me up, but we can't pick each other up because one of us has to be standing on a solid ground, on the basis of which we can act as a support for the other one. So there's a few things here actually that I'm borrowing again from Westerhoff, his commentary. He makes some very good explanations of what really Nāgārjuna is saying here. What's the deeper point? So one, it said that it replied to the Nyāyā's self-stultification objection. So it's saying that it's not saying that things cannot be valid cognizers. This is an important point. Nāgārjuna is not rejecting that there can conventionally be valid cognizers versus non-valid cognizers. But he's saying that it doesn't exist independently of human conceptuality, or even in Buddhism, we just say by sentient beings. That it exists in relation to our way of conceiving of the world. So the Nyāyā is wrong to say that if there's no inherent truth, there's no inherent validity, then nothing can be valid. So for example, we had the example last time of the meter stick, a ruler. Yes, a ruler can give a correct measurement of something, but that measurement in and of itself is based on our framework of measurement. We're the ones who made the idea of a meter in the first place. We can say, well, yes, this ruler is exactly 1 meter. That's correct. It's incorrect to say it's 2 meters, and it's incorrect to say that other ruler, which is wrong, is actually a meter. But neither of them is inherently a meter. A meter is just an idea that we have. And then on that basis, then we can say what's true and what's true, what isn't true. And the second thing is that Nāgārjuna is then giving his own system. He's giving an epistemological argument for emptiness. Because remember that we had the opponent saying, well, if you don't accept my realist semantics, wherein everything that we speak about refers to something real that is just a priori to our conceptions about it, then how do you posit any coherent semantics? And this is, so it said an epistemological system that's based on coherence. So what does this mean? So the example is that you start with a pre-theoretical belief. So it's like a hypothesis about things. Maybe things are this way. That appears trustworthy. You don't just say anything, but this is, again, how science works. This is how I was saying that Nagarjuna system is very much, it functions in accordance with science. It's very useful within thinking about the scientific worldview, that we make a hypothesis, we don't assume that it's true, but then we test it against other things, and then use what we then establish to make certain assumptions. And then we can test our assumptions. We can say, well, if my mind is valid, this must be true and this must not be true. I can even do an experiment, and I get more and more certainty. Well, this actually is, this seems to stand up to all of these possible objections. But it's still a theory in some sense. It's still, all of science is based on theory. There's nothing in science that's proven beyond a shadow of doubt. There's always a room for possible doubt. For example, classical physics for 200 some odd years was accepted as this is the way things are, because it really works. No one so far has shown any evidence or any kind of reasoning that disproves this. But fundamentally, it was wrong all along. It doesn't mean that it was useless. And some people towards the end of that, towards the turn of the 20th century, fiercely resisted any kind of counter evidence. We have Michelson and Morley, you might know about, who did the experiment that basically of the behavior of light in a vacuum, that essentially showed that what they considered ether. There was some kind of ether that was in space that was allowing things like gravity to function, electromagnetic fields, that it didn't work. There didn't seem to be an ether. And as a result, as I understand it, Michelson, one of the two scientists who did this experiment, became severely depressed because his entire worldview was shattered. What could he believe about the world? Everything we thought was true isn't true. But within not too long, certain other explanations started to supplant this. And given relativity and quantum mechanics, eventually there was a deeper understanding of things. So it's not as though we just threw out everything we knew. We just had to modify it. And this is how ultimately conventional understanding should be. They're conventional. They're provisional, we might say. We adopt this as long as it works, but at some point we might have to supplant it, and we are open to that possibility, as opposed to clinging to this as this is ultimately true at all times, and if this isn't true, then nothing. There's no basis for anything I've ever, considered true. This is part of the difficulty also with meditation and emptiness, that it's coming at our assumptions about the world. And sometimes it's why it's said it can be very dangerous, because it dismantles those. And if it goes too fast or it's misunderstood, we can dismantle our entire system of understanding who am I? Why am I leading a meaningful life? And especially, what's the purpose of practicing ethical discipline? Why don't I just do whatever I feel like because nothing matters? So this is the danger if we dismantle it too quickly or without appropriate approach. We have to be very careful of that. But it is understood that at least in the Madhyamaka system, ethics and other practices, they do hold up, but we get a deeper understanding of them. This is what we see in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. The Buddha is saying, of a bodhisattva should practice ethical discipline, but if he thinks I am practicing ethical discipline, that he's not practicing ethical discipline. The point being that the bodhisattva's ethical discipline is deeper. It's not just about believing in a real I, trying to achieve liberation from samsara. It's about trying to understand emptiness. And so to hold the view that I, a real person, am practicing a real ethical discipline that has a real basis in an inherent background of right and wrong, then this actually becomes an obstacle. And this is against the bodhisattva's ethical discipline. which is to meditate on emptiness continuously. But we have to be very careful with our approach to this, that it doesn't, as they say, fall into nihilism. So the example that Westerhoff uses is boats, right? So we build a little boat. We have the first boat here in the bottom right corner, which is like a very simple raft. That then as we go along, we might start replacing the boards and get a better boat. So the planks that we use to build the first boat are like our initial valid cognizers. And we need those. So for example, say we take this boat to we're on an island with no other woods. This is all we can build. We go to a better island with this stronger wood, and we can build a better raft. But without having built the first raft, we would have never gotten to the point where we could establish the second raft. So we need to always, use the tools we have to understand what we can understand. And this is how human knowledge has progressed over the centuries. Although our knowledge today far surpasses a lot of the things we knew 500 years ago, if we hadn't, gone, even though the progress of knowledge goes much faster now, but if that hadn't been the thousands of years of human progress getting to the point where we could progress this fast, then this wouldn't be happening at all. So you have to start with what tools you have to build a system of understanding, and then later supplant that with a better boat. And then you see in the bottom, there's a bigger boat. And then finally, you have an aircraft carrier, and even something that is much better able. So we might think of this as an analogy. The water is like the confusion of existential existence. Who are we? What is the purpose of our lives? And we build a boat that gives us some kind of sense of meaning in our life. But the boat has got all kinds of holes in it, and the water keeps flowing in. So, we keep being threatened by existential doubt. Maybe my whole system of understanding is wrong. But we keep building a better and better boat, and we get this aircraft carrier where, it's very, very difficult for anything to penetrate it, because we, our system of understanding is so thorough and complete. But maybe I like to think of it that we could have an even deeper understanding where we no longer need a boat, we can swim. And this is actually an analogy that was used by Vasubandhu, one of the great Indian scholars, who said that the relation of meditation and study. He said that study is like a tether. So you might know tethered swimming. Today we'd have a life vest would be a better example. But in the past, you didn't have a life vest. You learned to swim by tying a rope around somebody, and then they could try to swim. So at first, you need to have the rope, because if you don't, you're going to drown. But when you're very advanced in your practice, you can let go of the study, and you just understand things naturally because your mind is so conditioned to right view. Then you can swim on your own, and you no longer need to rely on an entire worldview. You just simply understand things as they are, and this is what it's dismantled. This isn't perhaps meditation and emptiness. So then we have Aryadeva. This is just a related point to this, this about mutual establishment. This is from his 400 stanzas. He says, the conditions are complete there before you look. But if mine's later, there's no point. Third would make the action moot. So what does this mean? He's saying the relation between cause and effect, which is the relation also between minds and their objects, because objects are known by minds, which in that sense, the mind is an effect of the object. There's an object, and then you can only have a mind that knows something if there's something to know. But then if we take this within the Madhyamaka standpoint, especially Chandrakirti's system, conventionally that's true. So conventionally, for example, there's a table here before I look at it. And then I look at it and then I establish it. So it's there before I look at it. So there is a cause and effect. But this is only conventional. If it existed inherently, this would be problematic. So because conditions aren't complete, it isn't there before you look. For something to exist, it has to be known in this system. That's the definition of existence, is something we can know. But before I look, I don't know it's there. So how do I know it's there? Really, I only know it's there once I've looked. it could be that it wasn't there before I looked at it. So if we assume that it inherently exists, I can't establish that. It wasn't there before I looked. But if mine's later, then there's no point. So if the mind comes after the object, there's actually no point in realizing it because the object is already established. If we say it's an inherently real object, there's no point in having a mind later to establish it. And the third possibility that the object and the action and the mind exist at the same time. But that would make the action moot, meaning that anything that is a cause and effect relationship has to exist temporally separately. They can't exist at the same time and be cause and effect. So if we say that the action is the action of knowing something, the knower, the known, and the object action of knowing can't all be at the same time. There has to be some temporal relation. So if they all exist inherently at the same time, then they have to be, we'd say, unrelated. Drelme Donshen in Tibetan. It means like no relation and totally different things. In which case they couldn't affect each other. Like two billiard balls that exist on a different side of the table at different times. They have no effect on each other. So there has to be, if we accept inherent existence, any one of these three has to be the case, but none of the three work, in which case it's showing that they can't be an inherently existent valid cognizer establishing an inherently existent real thing. So next also there's the father-son analogy, which is just the idea of if valid cognizers establish the objects and the objects establish the cognizers. If first the father generates the boy, and then the boy himself, moreover, generates his dad, then tell us who gives birth to whom. If each of them has access to the attributes of father and son, then I admit I have a doubt. Tell who's the father, who's the son. So this, of course, is absurd to think of a father who gives birth, a boy who gives birth to his own father. How does that make any sense conceptually? But this is saying, well, it's the same idea. If you want to say that there's a valid mind that's established by the valid object, and the valid object is established by the mind, is the same problem. They can't generate each other. So then finally we have the summary. This is the summary of this section of an epistemology. So he says, all valid minds don't prove themselves, nor mutually are they verified. They can't be proved by other minds, nor objects, nor without a cause. So first, they do not prove themselves. This is what we established about self-cognition. A mind can't establish itself as correct, but they can't be mutually verified. One mind you can't say that mind A establishes mind B and mind B establishes mind A. This is the problem we just talked about. That they can't, it's like two people trying to pick each other up. They can't be proved by other minds. So if we say that mind A and B are both proved by mind C, but then the problem is what proves mind C? And then see mind D, well then mind E, and then it becomes infinite regress. That doesn't work. Nor by objects, because as we said, if the object establishes the mind, then it's as though the object is the mind. And also, if the object establishes the mind, then it's as though the object is already established. But what established the object? And then we come back to the same problem. Nor without a cause. Of course, you can't say that it's established as true just without a cause by it in and of itself. How could anything be established without some cause? Otherwise, if one mind was established as valid without a cause, then all minds would be, because they'd be alike and not having a cause. If mind A was true and mind B was not true, then there must be some reason that the mind A is not true, and that therefore there's a cause for that. So I have the picture here. This is again based on Westerhoff, his example he gives, because he's in Britain, so he has the idea of the pound note. So he says, it's like if I have 50 pounds in my pocket, I want to verify, I think I have 50 pounds, so I want to check. So there's different ways I can establish that. I can pull it out of my pocket and look at it, and then I know there's 50 pounds. That's direct perception. Or I can know from inference. I can think, well, I just went to the bank and made a withdrawal, and I remember doing that. I can infer that it's still there. Or I can use an example that, well, I can see my hands in front of me, and likewise, I can infer that other things which I've verified with my eyes before, which was putting the money into my pocket, I can also assume are true. Or I can use testimony. I can ask somebody else. I can go back to the bank and say, didn't I just come in here and make a withdrawal? You can, oh yeah, I did, right? And you can, the teller can, yeah, I gave you 50 pounds. So now I know. But all of these, it's the same problem that how do I establish any of them? If I go back to the teller and ask her, well, did you give me 50 pounds? She says, yes. Well, how do I trust that? Maybe she's wrong. Maybe she is mistaken in her memory. So there's never a time when I can absolutely verify things. It always just becomes circular. This is a summary of this section. Okay, so now we have dispute 3, intrinsic virtue. So just to recap, this text includes 9 debates. So we've done 2 of them, but the last 7 here are much less complicated. They're kind of extensions of the previous ones. So some of the same themes will come up again, but maybe seen from a different angle. So we have intrinsic virtue, which is the idea that, like we said, that so there's right and wrong. We say that certain actions are positive and certain actions are negative. In Buddhism, this is very clear. So the opponent is going to argue, well, you claim that there are good and bad actions, that there's suffering and there's happiness and that there's enlightenment. So don't those exist real? If they aren't, then your whole system falls apart. So if he says, this is the opponent, the wise who know the state of things consider virtuous things to have a virtuous nature. Furthermore, the same holds true for other things. So see, we have the book of rules and regulations here, that there's this is the way things are. It's written in the book. So people who know things, the way things are, the wise ones who recognize right from wrong, they know that virtuous things have a virtuous nature. Remember, this is the point originally about a nature. Nāgārjuna agrees things exist, but they don't have a nature, which would mean something established beyond, that does not exist in mere name, that exists before we conceive of it in a certain framework. So furthermore, the same holds true for other things. So not only virtuous, but non-virtuous things, or as he goes on to say, those things that bring deliverance, all things whose state has been described. Their nature is deliverance. So too, the nature of the reverse. So deliverance is meaning liberation. You have the things that lead to liberation, the path that leads to liberation. In Buddhism, we say the 4 noble truths. They're true, right? So they must have a nature, must be some nature of truth to them. So the nature of the reverse, so those things that don't bring deliverance, the things that lead to suffering, they lead to that way. So they must have some kind of nature that's doing it. It's not just our mind. If it was just our mind, then really it wouldn't matter. If it was just, if it wasn't really a bad action, except in a way of conceiving of it, then I could just conceive of it differently, and then it would be okay to do whatever I want, and I wouldn't suffer as a result. So how does Nagarjuna respond? It says first, paralleling the opponent's first line, the wise who know the state of things, whatever virtuous nature that's in virtuous things that they express, they tell its features in detail. So if that was true, that there was a nature, then the wise would know about it. The Buddha would know about it. But the Buddha never talked about a nature of things, an inherent reality behind things. People might hear what he said and assume that there is, because it seems like, well, we all assume that if there's virtue and deliverance and liberation, there must be something real that he's talking about. So we assume that was meant, but he never specifically said, yes, there is enlightenment and it exists inherently in this way. It's just an assumption people made based on what he said. So then if that nature of virtuous things is born relying on something else, it's really something else's charge. How is it their essence then? So this is another argument that we say, okay, virtue is virtue in relation to another thing. For example, we practice virtue. Virtue doesn't arise in and of itself. We have to make some effort to have virtue, in which case it has a cause. If it has a cause, then it relies on something else. So it's really something else's charge, meaning something else is really in control of it. It's not in control of itself. So how is it their essence? Its essence actually relies on something else to exist. It doesn't exist in and of itself without relying on something else. So it doesn't have a nature. If it had a nature, it would exist intrinsically without having to rely on something else for its existence. Okay, so then I think, yeah, actually, I was just going to say in this regard, there's different within the Buddhist tradition. There's other ways of talking about this. So again, I've mentioned Thich Nhat Hanh before. His way of describing things, which is also often very practical, not so theoretical, but it's quite simple to say. Thich Nhat Hanh says, we believe in the Buddha, but we have to always remember that the Buddha is made of non-Buddha elements, right? That it's not like there's one inherent thing that is Buddha in and of itself. What we call a Buddha is a composite of many things that are not Buddha. It's a composite of parts. It's a composite of causes and conditions, which are not themselves Buddha. And likewise, our enemy is made of non-enemy elements. Right? Would I say that if I hate this person, do I also hate this person's intestines? I don't know, maybe, but probably not. So there's all these different parts that constitute the person. Why is it that I don't hate those, but I hate the thing that is considered the opposite of them? What is there more in over and above all the different parts? So likewise with virtue is made of non-virtuous elements. Or not non-virtuous in the sense of negative, but just things that aren't virtuous. If we have a person who practices virtue and they give charity, for example, the money they're giving is not inherently virtuous. The action of handing a piece of paper to somebody else is not inherently virtuous. It relies on a lot of things, especially on our conception of what makes something valuable, what makes the money valuable. If we didn't have that, then there would be no virtue created. But because within that system, it's doing something that's benefiting people, then we can say it's virtuous. But then Nagarjuna says in verse 55, but if instead that nature of all virtuous things is born without relying on another thing, there'd be no Brahma conduct to keep. So the point is exactly, if we say it relies on something else that has no nature, but if the opponent wants to say, no, it doesn't rely on anything else, virtue just exists in and of itself without having a cause, then there'd be no point in making any effort to practice virtue. So when he says Brahma conduct, it really is brahmacharya is the Sanskrit word here, which really means practicing a religious life, practicing celibacy. But that's it's more general. It's more just practicing virtue. That somebody makes effort towards practicing virtue. What's the point if virtue just arises in and of itself? So this relates also to what we talked about in terms of birth from another. Things are not born from themselves, nor are they born from another. If it was the real thing, if there was a real cause to virtue, and virtue rose from that in a real way, then they will be unrelated, because the real thing exists now, the virtue exists in the future. So if two things exist at different times but have to exist in a real way, if something exists in a real way, you have to pinpoint it. But I can't point to it right now. So I had the example of baking the cake, remember? That I say I'm making a cake, but where's the cake? There's no cake here right now while I'm making it. It's really just my own mind creating a connection between past and future. Later I see a cake and then I connect the dots and say, I made this. I'm connecting the action of my kneading dough with later there being a cake. But they don't exist in any kind of connection that I can actually point to. So likewise, my practice of virtue, we say, brings about enlightenment, but it's my own framework of understanding the world that's making that true. It's not that it's not true, but it's not true inherently in and of itself. It's only true within my framework of conceptualizing past and future and connecting things. Okay. And then further unwanted consequences. So if you say that there's intrinsic virtue, what has no cause is permanent. So all things will be permanent. All dharma and non-dharma and all worldly terms would not exist. So yeah, if you say that virtue doesn't have a cause, then it will be a permanent thing. And if nothing has a cause, all things will be permanent, because if something is impermanent, which anything that functions is impermanent, everything in the world is impermanent, it has to arise from causes. If it did not arise from causes, then you couldn't say it started now and it ended this time. The only reason it would end is because the causes that are sustaining it no longer sustain it. But if there's no cause, there's no reason for it to stop existing. So all things would be permanent. And all dharma, meaning virtuous actions and non-virtuous actions, and all worldly terms will not exist. All the things we talk about on a daily basis couldn't exist if they were permanent. If they were intrinsic, they'd be impermanent. So they can't exist intrinsically. Otherwise, they wouldn't exist at all. Non-virtues and non-specified, deliverance too, would have that fault. So we had virtue, now we have non-virtue. Non-specified means neutral action, things that weren't specified as either virtuous or non-virtuous. Deliverance too would have that fault of being permanent and therefore, not relying on anything else. And so for you, compounded things would uncompounded turn thereby. So compounded things, meaning things that rely on causes and conditions to come into existence. But for you, they'd become uncompounded. They wouldn't have any cause. They would be related to nothing else. So everything would be, wouldn't function. So we have the little raccoon here, his head is stuck in the grate. So the idea here is that if you accept this inherent existence, you can't get out of it. You're stuck. You've got no room for movement, no room to free yourself from this view, because you've accepted that things exist without relying on other things, and these consequences come about. So one way to see this is that some of you might know about the four seals. The four seals is four philosophical seals, meaning like four tenets of Buddhist philosophy that all Buddhist schools accept as true, which are that all compounded things are impermanent, and then all the contaminated things are suffering, and then all things that exist are selfless and empty, and that nirvana is true peace. So it's said that if somebody contradicts any of these, then they go outside the range of Buddhist philosophy. So all the Buddhist philosophers are trying to stay within these boundaries. So the opponent perhaps is accusing Nagarjuna of over interpreting the third seal. When things are all things are empty and selfless, the opponent has, if he's a Buddhist, would have his own interpretation of this, but he's saying Nagarjuna has gone too far and made everything non-existent. But Nagarjuna is turning it back on him and saying, actually, you're the one, by not taking that, by not really understanding the third seal, you've thereby negated the first seal, that all compounded things are impermanent. Because if you don't accept that things are empty, they cannot be impermanent, and therefore all compounded things will not be impermanent, and therefore your philosophy actually contradicts what the Buddha said. Hold on one second. So the permanent and permanent phenomena, are they totally the same? Yes, it's synonymous. It's actually, because in Tibetan, it's a little bit different than English. In English, the word permanent is an adjective, but in Tibetan, the word dakpa, which we translate as permanent, can be either an adjective or a noun. So it can be confusing, and this is, in debate, it makes it a lot easier actually, because you can say an impermanent means an impermanent thing, but you can also use the same word, so you can say an impermanent is impermanent, an impermanent thing is impermanent. So it actually makes it a lot easier to debate these things. But yeah, the point is that permanent in this context just means a thing which is impermanent. And how is permanent from an existence and independent arising? That's a good question. So in this system, existence do not have to be impermanent things. The functioning things, which means basically form and mind, body and mind. Body doesn't just mean your body, but physical things are functioning, and then minds are functioning things. But there can be things that exist but are not functioning, which are conceptually constructed things, such as meaning generalities, or absences is a good example. So there is an absence, I might use this before, of an elephant in this room. The absence of elephant has no functional quality. It's not like the absence of elephant here is somehow, so some people might conceive of it this way. There's some kind of force in this room that's keeping elephants out. As soon as that force disappears, all of a sudden there'd be elephant here. It's not like that in Buddhist philosophy. It's just a conceptual construct. Based on seeing a place that has no elephant, I can think there's no elephant. At the same time, it's true. It's right to say there's no elephant here. It's wrong to say there's no table here. So it exists. The lack of elephant exists here, but it's not a functional thing. However, it's a dependent arising because it exists. Now, the dependent arising has three levels of understanding. It can be that it's born from causes and conditions, which only applies to functioning things, but it can also be that it has parts. So permanent things still have parts. So lack of elephant actually is not a partless thing, although one might think, oh, it has, what are the parts of that? But we can say, well, there's the lack of elephant in this room, and there's the lack of elephant in the next room. Those are both instances of lack of elephant. So in that sense, they're parts of it. Or I can say that lack of elephant pervades this room. So I can say the lack of elephant in the far side of the room and the near side of the room. So it's actually it's something that exists over extended space. And also there's dependence on conceptuality, that things exist in relation to ways of framing them. So to say there's no elephant in this room, it requires a framework where we talk about what is a room and define the boundaries of that, and what is an elephant. This is what I've talked about before, that it exists only in relation to a particular framework of understanding things. But still, we say that it's true in that way. Okay. So further unwanted consequences. So just to mention here that, so the question, okay, well, if nothing is inherently true, there's no inherent suffering. If somebody asked me this question on email, well, then couldn't I just say that everything's pleasure and then just experience it that way? But, we say that it's a mere fiction you keep in mind, but they're very persistent. Our habits are very persistent. We can't just get rid of them by thinking, oh, it's not that way. So again, Westerhoff gives an excellent example here. He gives the example of money. That money is only valuable in and of the way that we conceive of it. Yet still, it's very functional and very powerful. I can decide, oh, I don't believe in money, but ultimately, I'm going to have to use money to function in the world and to continue my existence. And it's not going to work. The whole world could decide it doesn't believe in money, but you'd have to convince a lot of people. And really, I don't think you'd be able to convince them very convincingly. You wouldn't be able to make an argument that would then the whole world then gives up the idea of money. Even if eventually we did, we'd still have a lot of other concepts. We just function that way. We can't just get rid of our concepts by just saying, I don't think anymore. This is what I talked about before. The Buddha said, you can't just use concentration to be free of suffering. You have to have wisdom. So ultimately, perhaps at a very advanced level, somebody is beyond these concepts. And I talked about the idea that for some people, there's an idea that they can experience pleasure as pain. I gave the example in the email of, for example, Geshe, again, Jampa Wangdu, this friend of Lama Yeshe, who reports that when he fell down the stairs, every bop of his head sent waves of bliss through his body. This is understood to be a consequence of advanced tantric meditation, that somebody transforms their experience. This is not something that just happens randomly or just being crazy. And it's not like somebody might ask, well, you need pain to function in the world. You need to be able to know, okay, my finger's in pain, so therefore I should withdraw it from the fire. This is why pain is understood as an evolutionary thing that is necessary. Without pain, we couldn't exist. But really, what we need is some kind of indicator. We don't need it to be painful in the sense that it causes us suffering. So he was indicating, okay, my head hitting the stairs. And maybe if he could stop it, he would have. But it doesn't mean it has to be experienced as unpleasant. There's a separate, the stimulus and the reaction to it versus the pleasant and unpleasant are actually different responses. And just to give one other example, there are others that I mentioned, one other in the email, but one other that I didn't mention. Some of you might know the great Kagyu Lama, Kagyu the Chetsong Rinpoche, Drikung Chetan Rinpoche, was the head of the Drikung Kagyu school. So I read his biography a few years ago, which I'd recommend, called From the Heart of Tibet. It was written by one of his Western students. And it's reported that at one time, when he was visiting some holy site with some of his students, they'd driven there, and then he was getting out of the car, and his attendant slammed the door, not realizing that Rinpoche's hand was still in the door. So they crushed his hand, and the attendant was obviously kind of aghast at this. So I just hurt my teacher. I feel terrible. So then, to make him feel better, his Chetsang Rinpoche said to him, "Well, don't worry. Actually, when you slam my hand in the door, I just felt waves of bliss through my body." So again, this is supposed to be what happens when somebody, achieves very advanced levels of this. So then it's a question here. Hence, permanent phenomena always arise together with a conceptual mind. Yes. As it seems as a mental construct, yes. So permanent phenomena it's called, one way to describe it is permanent phenomena are things that can only appear to conceptual consciousness. They cannot appear to direct perception. Now, there actually is some debate about this, because we talk about, for example, can emptiness appear to direct perception? So the higher schools, Madhyamaka and Chittamatra, they accept that permanent things can in fact appear to direct perception. They have a lot of arguments for how that works. But generally speaking, for ordinary people, they only appear to conceptual consciousness. They don't, something that appears to your sense consciousness or appears to direct mental experience has to be functioning in and of itself. Otherwise, it would always appear or never appear. And also it would just exist in a completely static way. But we can conceive of things. We can make ideas about things, and some ideas are more true than others. So we can say this is a correct conception of how things are. So yes, and as I said, the main permanent thing is meaning generalities, which is meaning generality is the way that we make conceptually construct our world. So the pain as pleasure only happens if you have adequately removed dualistic appearances and are only seeing everything as a display of Buddha nature. Essentially, yeah, that's basically true. Although there could be other ways. We talk about other kinds of meditation. So somebody could achieve the dhyanas, the concentrations, at which point they may be able to go beyond experiencing suffering in a gross way. So the Buddha said this is actually a danger, because you think that you're liberated, but you're not. So it's very important to understand the different causes and conditions that bring these things about, and to know whether this experiencing pain as pleasure is really a result of enlightenment, or whether it's just the result of some kind of mundane, even just ordinary people might take drugs and everything you experienced as pleasurable for a period of time. That doesn't necessarily mean you're liberated. So it's different. I mean, the meditation is a little bit probably healthier for your body, but at the same time, it's creating a conditioned experience as opposed to something that is gone beyond conditioning. So next we have the next dispute, dispute for names without objects. So here we have Nagarjuna's argument. It's very similar to the first debate about things not, if everything, nothing has a nature, then your words are also natureless. So what do they even express? So the opponent argues, if all things have a nature, then the name of natureless as well is in that way reduced to naught. There is no name without a base. So what this opponent is assuming is that any name, any word that we use has to correspond to a simple real thing in the world. This is the realist semantics, it's called. This is the Nyāyā system, that every concept we have and then the name that corresponds to that concept. So I didn't like to use the word concept, but we can say conceptual construct that we have, it corresponds to something real. So in their system, for example, we have an apple. An apple is a real thing that exists above and beyond all individual apples. But each individual apple then it substantiates this real, we say the idea apple. This is to use Plato's terminology, but it's very similar. But then a red apple also substantiates red. So one thing can substantiate many different qualities. Red apple substantiates apple and red and sweetness, all different kinds of things that are real, real entities that then are substantiated in this thing. Now, one of the arguments against this by Dharmakirti is that then it becomes endless. So George Dreyfus, who's a great scholar of Dharmakirti, he gives the example, what if we had the quality of middle-aged bald men? So it's like, how far do we want to go with this? There's this man here, he's substantiating middle-aged bald men. Is that also a real quality that exists? Then do we have middle-aged bald men who watch football? And he's substantiating that quality as well. Every single thing we can imagine, every single category has to be real in the world. Then it just goes on endlessly, every minute thing we can think about. But in any case, this is the way the opponent is assuming. So he's saying that if you say that nature doesn't exist, then the words, you just said nature. So it has to be a real thing because you can talk about it. If it didn't exist, you couldn't talk about it. So this, Nagarjuna responds to this. For you who say such names exist together with a nature, then it's you who has to answer here. I don't assert such names exist. So it's saying that you're assuming a realist semantics. That was your system. I don't assert that system. So it's you who has to give it a way of how that functions. I don't assert that something I refer to has to really exist. But then he comes around and turns it back on the opponent. This name of non-existence, does it exist or not exist? If it exists or doesn't exist, in either case, your thesis fails. So the opponent is saying, if nature doesn't exist at all, if nature is non-existent, then you have these problems. But you just use the word non-existence. So does non-existence exist or not? If non-existence exists, then it's not non-existent. But if non-existence doesn't exist, then you can't talk about it, because in your system, you can't talk about anything that doesn't exist. So in either case, your thesis fails. Your thesis being that if you talk about something, it has to exist. Seems to be a bit of a problem. So here, I've just given a couple of examples of how this could apply. So we have Saint Anselm. Some of you might know Saint Anselm of Canterbury, who I think lived in the 11th century. So he had a famous argument. This was people arguing for the existence of God. And it might seem a little absurd to us, but a lot of the medieval arguments, as I said, this was a reificationist world. For us nowadays, we're used to a materialist worldview where it's kind of assumed that our concepts don't have a real correspondence with real things. Whereas in the medieval times, certainly, it was quite the opposite. People tended to believe that a lot of the things they believed were corresponding to something real. There was a whole system of logic that underlay the entirety of existence. And God had created all of these things, and everything existed logically. And as a consequence of that, people had thoughts like, it's hard to imagine what it was like to live in this time. If you heard thunder, you'd automatically assume that God is sending me a warning. This is generally how people thought, that God created this, right? So God is somehow creating, and I heard it, so God must have known I was going to hear the thunder, so he must have been trying to communicate something. So there is an assumption. So as Anselm was trying to say, well, how do we know God exists? Well, he said, well, imagine the most perfect thing you can possibly imagine. And then, well, does it exist or not exist? Well, it must exist because existence is more perfect than non-existence. So therefore, God must exist. Because if he didn't exist, he wouldn't be perfect. And we couldn't therefore think of a perfect thing. So this, again, it seems very strange to us, but this was a way that they tried to prove that this perfect thing exists. So I have the picture here. This is just, I thought it was interesting because I mentioned before in one of the early talks about my teacher from college, Daniel Dennett, philosopher, and he arguing against Anselm's argument for God. He says, well, what if I said there's the most perfect cake I can possibly imagine? But if it doesn't exist, it's not perfect, so it must exist. So the most perfect cake, must exist in the world. And I don't know, maybe that is a good argument against them. We have to think about it. And the other point we have at the bottom here is just, it reminds me, this argument about non-existence. Nāgārjuna is basically trapping the person with his words. And so it relates to a riddle that I remember hearing when I was young about some explorers, European explorers we have here coming to an island of, the natives, I don't know if that's a politically correct way to say it, but they come to an island of natives who were cannibals. And they say to the explorers, well, we're going to eat you, but we're either going to boil you in water or we're going to fry you in oil. So you have a choice. And if you want us to boil you in water, then you tell us something that's true. And if you want us to fry you in oil, then you tell us a lie. So it said, what did the explorers say that got them off the hook and saved their lives? Does anybody have a good answer to that? I'll give you 10, 15 seconds and then I'll just answer. Okay, so what they said was, you will fry me in oil, right? So if that's true, which it would be if you fry me in oil, then it contradicts. You said if I say something true, you're going to boil me. But if it's a lie, then you can't fry me in oil because I'd be wrong. So therefore, you can't fry me in oil, and therefore you can't kill me, and then I can escape. I don't know if natives would let them off the hook. Maybe they just say we're going to kill you anyway. But this an idea of trapping somebody with their logic. So here Nagarjuna is saying, you say that everything we talk about has to exist, and therefore your words are non-existent. But then if you talk about non-existence, then that has to either exist or non-exist. So next, Nagarjuna just comes back with, I never said language refers to substantial things, right? That this whole issue is your issue. I didn't say this. So already I've explained for you the emptiness of everything. So while I gave no thesis, what's to rail against? You take a look. So you might imagine Nagarjuna saying, the person yelling at him continuously, but he's just saying, I didn't say that. So, so I think the point here, again, I'm borrowing from Westerhoff, I've borrowed quite a few of his explanations, which are very helpful, is that what this comes down to, we have realist semantics, and we have Nagarjuna's system, which is not a realist system. And the opponent is continuously trying to apply his realist semantics to Nagarjuna's relativistic system, and this doesn't work. But he's assuming that Nagarjuna accepts realist semantics, which he doesn't. So you don't have, if you don't accept realist semantics, then this argument doesn't work for me. I don't accept that everything you say, or that I say, has to correspond to something that really exists and is findable in the world. So next we have dispute 5, extrinsic nature. So here we have Nagarjuna saying that the nature, so what are the referent, we might say. So we remember that because they referent, we talk about emptiness, it's saying that the referent of a term is not locatable or findable within the bases of designation. We say, for example, pot, but we can't find a thing that actually is a pot intrinsically. within any of the parts of the pot or the basis of the designation. So, okay, well, the opponent thinks, well, pot must refer to something. So are you saying that pot refers to something else other than extrinsic to the parts? Then he says, or if nature does exist, but isn't found among all things, then kindly demonstrate for us this nature that's abandoned things. So, okay, well, did you say that nature, that there is a referent for the term, but that this referent is not found among the parts? Well, then we have like here a heart that's just floating in the ocean. It exists somewhere else. The nature, the essence of something exists far off in some distant land. This actually is related to an argument about the nature of self. Chandrakirti talks about this, that we say, well, when I say person, what do I refer to? So the non-Buddhist schools understand that the person can't refer to any of the parts of the person. The hand and the eye are not the person. So there's a conceptual problem here. So therefore, they posit something else. They say that the person is the Atman. It exists over and above the body and the mind. It's something totally different from them. So although this might seem very strange, this idea of extrinsic substances, this is actually philosophically a common position. You know, a lot of religions taught that a soul, that really who I really am is totally different from my body and my mind. It's something totally separate. But then Chandrakirti says, well, then the other Buddhist schools, other than the Madhyamaka, then see the fault in this. They see that there's all kinds of conceptual faults if I say that I'm totally different from my body and my mind. For example, then how can I say I'm sick when my body is sick? And I've come up with a sense of myself based on my experience of my body and my mind. And then to construct that and then say I exist separately, it's like over-reifying the concept that I've made. And furthermore, if I exist separately from my body and my mind, then who's aware of what, right? Well, if I say my mind, but then, you know, my mind, do I say that one part of my mind is aware of my other part of my mind that's not me? Which seems to be a bit of what some of the other schools are saying. So there are different arguments about this. But the Buddhist schools then say, well, therefore, the person does exist among the aggregates. So they say that the referent must exist. If there's no referent for person, then again, there's no karma, there's no action, there's no cause and effect. So of course, there must be a person. The Buddha, when he said selflessness, he wasn't just negating there's any person at all. So it exists among the parts, that it's either, some of them say it's the collection of parts is the person, or some of them, like the Chittamatra school, actually say there's something hidden. There's an all-ground consciousness, which is a more fundamental aspect of who you really are. It exists among your aggregates because it is part of your consciousness. It's one aspect of consciousness, but it's not something manifest in our everyday experience. Very similar to the Western concept of unconscious mind. It has some important differences, but the idea is that it's an aspect of mind that's not experienced day to day. It's beyond our day-to-day experience. And then Baba Viveka, for example, who claims to be a Madhyamaka, but who Chandrakirti says is going against the Madhyamaka system in his assertions, and claims that the mind is the person. When we say I, what we're really referring to is my mind, because my mind is what goes from life to life. The body is not really the person. So there'd be intrinsic or extrinsic. But then Chandrakirti says neither of those are correct. Both of them are misunderstanding the Buddhist teaching. There really isn't a referent, but still things can function. It's possible for things to function without there being a referent that we can locate. Now, conventionally, there's a referent in the sense that, yes, there's a person, but there's no conventional thing we can locate that corresponds to that. But here, we're just negating that there's some extrinsic substance, right? So this seems pretty easy to negate. So Nāgārjuna just says, quoting the person, or if a nature does exist but isn't found among all things, although this doubt is incorrect, this is a doubt that you have sown. So I didn't say that. So you said, well, if it's not found intrinsically, it must be extrinsic. So therefore, you know, you have these problems. He said, I didn't say that. I didn't say it's intrinsic or extrinsic. So we have maybe the opponent scratching his head. He's been throwing it back on him. That I didn't actually, you know, I accuse you of this doubt. I made up this whole problem and said it's your doubt, but it actually He didn't say that, so I can't really argue that against him. So again, this is the same problem of the opponent assuming that Nagarjuna has realist semantics, that in his system, that things refer to real things. And also that in the opponent's system, well, actually, no, this comes in with the next point. So we go to the next system, the next dispute, dispute 6, negation and existence. So here, the opponent is arguing, the words "no pot inside the house" negate a real existent thing. So your negations of a thing existing within nature too. So he said, the opponent's system, he says, well, there's no pot in the house, right? We can say that, we can talk about that. But a pot is a real thing. It's just not, it doesn't exist here, but in general, it exists somewhere. And therefore I can conceive of it and I can say it's not in the house. So again, it's the same issue of assuming realist semantics. All simple terms in a statement must refer to some object in the world. Now, in the opponent's system, this is what I was going to say before, absence of something is also a category in its own right that can be substantiated. So this house without a pot also instantiates non-pot. But non-pot is a real thing that I can talk about. But again, it has to be something that can be instantiated. So non-pot is it's a lack of something that does exist. A pot does exist, and then therefore non-pot can also exist in certain places. There's no pot inside the house. So Nagarjuna responds, if only what exists can be negated, emptiness is proved. For you yourself chose to negate this very lacquer of nature in things. So again, he's coming right back on the opponent. You said emptiness doesn't exist, but you said if something can be said to not exist, it must exist. So therefore emptiness exists. Maybe it doesn't exist here, but it exists somewhere. So we can imagine the opponent, whoops, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have said that. So he says, or if the emptiness that you negate is non-existent, well, negations of existent things, has not this very thesis failed? So right, either emptiness exists or it doesn't. If it does exist, then saying it doesn't exist is wrong. But if you say that it doesn't exist, then your statement that everything that negates something negates a real thing, so you're saying emptiness is wrong, then that can't be a real right statement, because emptiness is a non-existent thing. So you can't talk about it and say it doesn't exist. So also we have, okay, why is it that all people have the same conceptual image of a tree, pot, and pillar, which are universal more or less if the things don't have an essential nature? Well, this I talked about before, that we have to ask, do they have the same concept, right? I mean, Thich Nhat Hanh's statement I mentioned, that even if I said to you, I accept Jesus, my Jesus would be different from your Jesus. That really, can we verify that what is appearing to our minds is exactly the same? So we have a shared idea of a tree, but that doesn't have to be something that exists in and of itself. It can be because we talk about it. We grew up in the same culture that talks about what a tree is, and we therefore formed an image of a tree that's based on similar concepts that we shared. However, really, it might be very different. When I talk about a tree and think about a tree, I might have a juniper tree appear to my mind. And you think about a tree and you might have an appearance of an oak tree. So actually what appears to our mind is very different. We can still make coherent statements about it. We can say trees are tall and trees are made of wood. But if I say, how tall is a tree? Well, then we say, what tree, right? And then we have to let go of that and make a more specific concept. But even then, whatever concept we come up with, what appears to you and me might be very different. So yes, we can have universals in the sense of something that can be conceived as a category that subsumes all of the different instances of it. But at least in the Buddhist system, that category doesn't exist beyond how we conceptualize it. There's nothing, it's not that the conception that we have accesses a real thing that existed before we came up with that conception, which is the Nyāyā system here, that there's a tree idea tree that exists in an ideal world that's been instantiated in the world. Actually, I'll talk about this again tomorrow in the last talk, because I do want to talk about how some of this is applicable. But yeah, it's a good question you ask. So we name things depending on how they function, don't we? Yes. But the question is here, is there something that exists? This is the Garden of Eden analogy I made the first time. That is it there, it exists there, and then we name it, or by naming it, do we thereby create something? So we have the example of Indonesia, right? So Indonesia only exists because some people came up with this idea. There was French Indochina, and then there was the Dutch East Indies, which were both ideas that were created by the French and the Dutch, respectively. There was no such unified country of either of them before the colonists came. But then when the French left, the colonized people who were now free no longer wanted to be identified by this, so they broke back into their original countries. Whereas in Indonesia, they decided to keep this system, and therefore Indonesia now exists, and it's a functioning thing. And we can say that Indonesia, we could. I don't mean to be derogatory, but this is what I've heard, that say Indonesia burns so much forest land each year that it pollutes the world, so therefore it's harmful. So somebody could say, well, it's that's referring to Indonesia as a functioning thing that's burning the forest. And well, then you could say, well, no, but it's not. When we say Indonesia burned the forest, what we really mean is the people in Indonesia burned the forest. Okay, I'll say people in Indonesia burn the forest. But who are the people? It's their hands that are lighting the fire, probably. So it's not really, is there any person beyond the hand that's doing the action? And then we say, well, okay, the hand is lighting the fire, but then you can go further more. And is it the molecules in the hand that are doing this, or a chemical reaction that's causing this? So in this sense, we're creating the thing by naming it. At the same time, there's correct and incorrect ways of naming. This is the understanding of emptiness, that it's very subtle. And so we have to think about this. I won't get any more into it now, but it's great that you're asking these questions, because these are basically the same debates that the person is debating with Nagarjuna. He's saying, you want to accept as a functional world, don't you? So how can you say everything just exists in name? So we say negating a non-existent. Because there's nothing to negate, I don't negate a thing at all. So you're negating such a claim that you have made is incorrect. So this is talking about inherent existence. There's no inherent existence to negate. So it's not as though it existed and then I negate it and make it non-existent. Your claim that I'm negating something is incorrect. I'm not negating anything. So am I doing anything? Am I say non-inherent existence doesn't exist? Am I negating anything? So I just have this picture here of a footprint. I just had this here because this is based on, again, Westerhoff gives the example. In the Nyāyā system, what could they say that there's no yetis? So I don't know if there is a yeti or not. Actually, Lama Zopa Rinpoche tends to think there is, from what I've read about. So I don't know. I have some doubt about that. But if we took the mainstream view, which is that yetis are imaginary, there's no such thing as a yeti, abominable snowman, as sometimes it's called. Could we say there's no yetis in their system? Can you say that if there's no such thing? So he says, well, maybe they would argue, you could say there's no large white snowman who lives in the Himalayas. So you have, an ape-like creature which exists, and you have white which exists, and you have the Himalayas. So you see, there's no large white ape-like creature that exists in the Himalayas, and therefore you're negating an existent thing, like saying there's no pot in the house, and thereby implicitly understanding the lack of existence of a yeti. I don't know if they would argue that, but nevertheless, it's a bit of a problem for their system, because most of us would say there's no yeti, and we'd agree that that's a perfectly reasonable way to talk, and we understand each other. So again, when Nagarjuna says, I don't negate anything, Really, his point is, I don't negate anything within a realist semantics. According to your system, where everything that exists must correspond to something real in the world, then I'm not negating anything. It doesn't mean I'm not saying anything at all. It doesn't mean that I don't have my own system. So I am in fact negating something. But what does it mean to be negating with the Nagarjuna system? So from here, okay, I didn't put it in right away, but it'll come up later. But it was the next slide. But that the idea is basically that negation doesn't necessarily mean that something exists and then you make it non-existent. So here we have, this is what comes up in here, dispute 6b. If that nature doesn't exist, then what's it that these words negate? Even without words, you can negate a non-existent thing. So again, he's assuming that if something it doesn't exist, it can't be negated. There's no point in negating something that doesn't exist. Negation should make something non-existent. So we have a cold fire, for example. Can you say there's no such thing as a cold fire? Well, according to his system, you can't. But you could say that there's fire and there's no cold in the fire, because cold exists and fire exists. You have to put together two things that exist and say they don't exist together, and thereby you understand that cold fire doesn't exist. But you can't just negate something that doesn't exist at all. You have to exist somewhere to be able to negate it. So Nagarjuna responds, first quoting him, even without words, you can negate a non-existent thing. That's what you said. My words don't stop what once was born. It's unreal, they just make known. This is the main point. This is an important point. So saying things don't exist, yeah, negation doesn't necessarily mean making something non-existent. There's two ways to negate something. One is to actually make it non-existent, like here, smashing a pot. But one is simply to realize something doesn't exist. So you are negating the wrong view that it exists. So in that sense, you're making something that exists not exist. But what you're making it non-exist is just simply a conception of things. So you have the person looking in the house. You think somebody's in the house and you look in, there's no one there. So it doesn't make him not there, but it does change your mind. It does make it so that you no longer think he's there when you thought he was there. So here's what I was thinking was coming on the next slide. Here it is. Two objects of negation. This is Tsongkhapa. This is from the Lamrim Chenmo, the great sages of the path. He says there's object of negation by reason and object of negation by the path. So it's important to distinguish between these two different objects of negation. So object of negation by reason is inherent existence. So Tsongkhapa says if it existed, it couldn't be negated. The whole point of negating something by reasoning is that it never existed in the first place. Otherwise, no matter how much reason you used, you couldn't make it non-existent. Reason is supposed to correspond or describe what exists, not supposed to change what exists. So this is the main object of negation, inherent existence. When we use all these reasonings to establish emptiness, mainly we're trying to negate inherent existence, which doesn't exist in the first place. We're just trying to prove or show that it doesn't exist. And then we have the object of negation by the path, which is the conception of inherent existence or the belief in inherent existence. So if it didn't exist, there would be no need to counter it. So Tsongkhapa says the first one can't exist, but the second one has to exist. If we didn't have any belief in inherent existence, there'd be no point in trying to negate it. All this talk about emptiness would be useless. But it's useful because there is actually something that needs to be gotten rid of. It's not inherent existence itself, but our belief in it. So this is the secondary object of negation, because the only way to counter it is to negate the first one. So yes, we have to, this is what we really want to get rid of, but the only way to get rid of it is to negate inherent existence with reasoning. So to make this existent thing non-existent, we have to prove the non-existence of something that ever existed to begin with. So then again, I've quoted Wittgenstein here, just because, as I say, I think he often describes a similar concept, but in maybe words that are more accessible to us. So he says, where does our investigation get its importance from? since it seems to destroy everything interesting. That is all that is great and important. So what we are destroying is nothing but a house of cards. And we are clearing up the ground of language in which they stand. So what Nagarjuna is saying is, I'm not really negating anything, in the sense that it's not like I'm destroying our whole system of understanding the world. What I'm negating is just our language that we use, that are showing that everything we've conceived about is based on a whole system of language that doesn't correspond to real things. So it's like a house of cards. If you just knock over one, the whole thing falls apart. So I'm not negating what you think is great and important. There's different ways to understand this, but we could say that it's only great and important based on your ascribing those qualities to it. So I'm just showing you that you're the one ascribing those qualities. It's not actually inherent in the thing. Now, yes, of course, enlightenment is great and important. We want to achieve that. But as we talked about in the 60 stanzas course, that if you grasp too strongly onto enlightenment, it's this great and important thing that I need to achieve, that actually becomes an obstacle, because then you're making it too real, and what you need to understand is the lack of reality of things in order to achieve it, lack of inherent existence in order to achieve, or to negate your wrong view of inherent existence. So it's a bit of a dichotomy. It's a tension within Buddhist philosophy, really, because it's, on the one hand, it's saying you really need to make effort and don't be lazy. Put a lot of effort into this, but at the same time, it's saying that does this exist? What's the none of this exists inherently. So there's nothing to achieve. One thing I've read about somebody mentioning, I think it's a very way to understand it, is that this dichotomy in Tibetan philosophy, based on the Nalanda system, there's been a strong emphasis on trying to resolve it philosophically. So, for example, we have Shantideva, right? So he directly goes at this point. He says, like, Gelde semshin yomena sulaninje chashena mompe drebe dundu kelampe mompe dapagangem po, which is if there's no sentient being, then for whom are we generating compassion? So then his answer is, the person for whom we pledged to achieve the result, we imputed them by ignorance. So it's for their purpose. So there is something that we imputed, that we're doing it for that purpose. And then it says, Semchin me dre suyen, Semchin me dre suyen, dende onkyang monle do. Dugal near shiwe cheer, mompa dopamicha ho. Drepo mompa dopicha. So this is, if there's no sentient being, then who achieves the result? So then Shantideva says, that's true. There isn't a sentient being, there's no one who achieves the result. However, it's posited by ignorance. And in order to, this is the important point, in order to pacify suffering, then don't counter your ignorance of the result. You have to keep that for the time being. You have to keep your conception of there being something real to achieve, otherwise you're not going to achieve it. And you do want to negate suffering. If you feel that you're so far beyond suffering that you don't need to believe in it anymore, then go ahead. But probably, if you really look at yourself, you're not. So if you want to be beyond that, you need to have a conceptual system that allows you to get beyond that. So this is, how in Tibetan, the Tibetan system often tries to resolve this with philosophy, whereas in East Asia, there was much more an emphasis on not trying to resolve the problem. It becomes a kind of paradox. And this is what we have, like a koan in Zen. So a Zen practitioner, for example, or Chan is really the more appropriate word, because Chan is the Chinese word, which was then adapted as Zen in Chinese, in Japanese, and then as Son in Korea. But the word originally Chan, which translates dhyana in Sanskrit, so it just means concentration, really. But the idea is the focus on meditation as opposed to philosophy, is that the teacher will say to you, if you have Buddha nature already, why are you still suffering? And then rather than try to make a whole philosophy of why that works, you then have to sit with that for a long time and try to think, maybe I have maybe my whole conception of things is wrong. I have to just sit with this paradox and focus on it until it resolves itself. And I have a totally different way of seeing things. So that's a different approach. I can't say one is better than the other. Certainly in Tsongkhapa's system, he's quite hostile to Hashang, the Chinese monk who was into that. I don't know. One person mentioned to me that it's like, if you look at Chinese culture, it was a very sophisticated culture, even before Buddhism came to China. That was actually an obstacle because the Chinese were a little bit resistant. They didn't respect Indian culture very much. It was considered an uncivilized country. So why would we adopt this system of philosophy, of practice from India? So it took quite some time for Chinese people to take to Buddhism. But also because people were already so full of concepts, there was perhaps an emphasis on needing to get beyond that and not think so much, stop worrying so much about things and get getting to a more concentrated state where it's simpler. Living in Zen is a very emphasis on austerity, and austerity not just in terms of not eating a lot or something like that, but not having a lot of artwork. In Zen temples, there often is not even an image of the Buddha. There's just a mirror. Whereas if you hit Tibetan temples, it's like kind of, we say, Baroque. The more decoration, the better. So perhaps this was useful for the people in that culture. And of course, it's not to say that all Chinese philosophy Buddhism was like that. Actually, there was a lot of Buddhist philosophy in China. It just happens to be that at least in modern times, the Chan or Zen system has been what's become more prominent in the West, maybe because we have a similar issue of being very sophisticated in our thinking. Whereas in Tibet, it was quite the opposite. People generally had no education whatsoever. So if you just have a nomad and you say there's no mountains and no trees, nothing exists, it's not really, maybe not very helpful. It's actually more important that this person trains their mind to think more clearly. So maybe it's just different approaches for different people. But as I said before, that I think it's still very useful to think about philosophy, even if we already come from an educated system, because in some sense we have more concepts we need to counter. And it's important to recognize that even in Chan and Zen, this is a misconception that somebody just in the first day, they just say, sit down with a koan. That's actually not how it works. It's actually only at very advanced levels that people go beyond study, similar to the Tibetan system. A lot of Chan monks or nuns will enter the monastery, the nunnery, and for a long time they won't be doing this. They'll be studying or working. There's a lot of preliminary that has to go into that. It's like I said, the first day, His Holiness the Dalai Lama saying, we hear about the master hits his disciple over the head with a stick, and then he was enlightened. We have this common theme, and then that it's not just like magic, that this person had to train a lot to get to the level where that was actually effective with their mind. So, okay, so I have this quote here from Dharmakirti. I mentioned he also argues against the realist semantics. So he just, it's related to this point. He says, because with real things, sounds don't have a correlation one-to-one, you can't infer their subjects from them. They show the speaker's state of mind. So this is in relation to an argument in the first chapter of his text. You say chapter 1, verse 217, toward the end of the chapter, about the Vedas. He's arguing with the Vedic philosophers. And their philosophy is this Nyāyā philosophy, that everything we talk about refers to a real thing in the world. And so he's arguing that can't be. Otherwise, you could infer the subjects from them. So if I said pot, there'd have to be a pot here. You can't infer that something exists just because I said it. So he goes on for quite a while trying to argue with them. But he says that what does a word, and what can you infer from a word? All you can infer is the speaker's state of mind. Meaning all you can infer is that the person had the intention to say that. You can't infer anything else, just simply from hearing the word. Now, of course, he might argue, well, what if somebody didn't mean to say it? It was a mistake. So he says in the auto commentary, if it's the case that the person is not crazy or didn't say something by mistake and so on and so forth, well, then how do we know that they said it intentionally and not by mistake? This is actually, we debate this point, but some people say, well, you can generally examine somebody. You get to know somebody, you can tell they're not crazy. And you can examine the way that they're talking and know that it's relevant to what they were saying. It wasn't just something that slipped out accidentally. So you can infer that they meant to say it. So you can infer that there was some intention behind it, which actually is relevant, again, with the argument of the Vedas, because the Vedic philosophers are arguing that nobody spoke the Vedas. It just arose in and of itself. But Dharmakirti is saying that can't be. In order for speech to be there has to be preceded by an intention to speak on somebody, in somebody's mind. But this is an entirely different argument. We're talking about the Vedas. We had a whole section on this a couple of years ago. We debated this for a month, talking about Dharmakirti, his logic, and arguing against the Vedas. And this very verse is then followed by a section on, well, how can you, Buddhist, claim that your scriptures are authoritative? How can anything be authoritative if it doesn't refer to a real thing? So this is another very important point, but I won't get into it because it's not relevant to what we're talking about now. Maybe someday we can do a course on some of Dharmakirti's philosophy, which, as I said, is not Madhyamaka philosophy, but for Tsongkhapa, it's just as important as Chandrakirti for understanding Madhyamaka philosophy, because Dharmakirti had a very coherent system of logic that Tsongkhapa then adopts to understand Chandrakirti's system, which isn't as precise in terms of giving a whole system. It's like in India, oftentimes the texts are very hard to read because they don't use the same words to refer to the same things every time, whereas the Tibetan texts are a lot more precise. They actually made a much more coherent system where it's, okay, this is what we mean by this word, and we're only going to use it for this purpose, and therefore we can build upon that. So Tsongkhapa made this fusion using Dharmakirti's system and Chandrakirti's system together. Okay, so next is the morality analogy, but I think we can leave that for tomorrow. I think it'll be pretty easy to finish tomorrow, actually, so we can assume that tomorrow will be the last course. But if by some chance we don't, this is perfectly fine. We can have one more day next weekend, not in any hurry. Yeah, it's a little past 1, but if anyone has questions, it's perfectly fine. We can have a few questions now. Okay, apologies, yeah, please, no problem, go ahead.
Joya has a question, I think.
Yeah.
Joya, you're unmuted, go ahead.
We can't hear you. I can't hear you.
We can't hear you, Joya ji. We can see you.
If you need, you can type it in the chat. We can't hear you, unfortunately. Maybe your speaker is not on, microphone.
Yeah, Joyaji, you can type it out. In the meanwhile, anyone else has a question, it's easier if you raise your hand from the reactions button. Venerable, I have a question, but it's,
Yes, please.
I don't know if it's directly related to what we're talking about, but
Mhm.
what is the relationship between the clear light mind and
Mhm.
Buddha's mind or Buddha?
Okay.
So
Yeah, that's a good
sentient
question.
beings
Yeah.
have a clear light mind, but they're not Buddha, right?
Yes. Well, to say you have a clear light mind, I think it's like, I mean, generally, yes, that's true, but it's not as though there's a clear light mind that exists separately from the rest of the mind. It's more like the fundamental nature of the mind. We say nyuksem, another way to refer to it, which means fundamental mind. You know, it's like if you have water, then the nature of the water uh, is 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 fluidity, right? So water has fluidity, but it's not like you can find that within the water. It's more like it's the fundamental nature of it. So in that sense, this is the fundamental nature of the mind, the most, the deepest, you'd say deepest, again, not like underneath, but um, sort of the most basic level of the mind in its most basic state. And so that is the same in the sentient being in the Buddha, because that doesn't change. No matter what thought you have, the nature of the mind stays the same. Now, this is understood in Geluk to be the conventional nature of the mind. It's not the ultimate nature of the mind, which is emptiness, the same as the ultimate nature of anything. Some of the other schools have a different view on that. But here, it's the conventional nature. So, like the nature of fire is heat, right? It's just the way that it exists conventionally. But in any case, that doesn't change. So you could say, well, everything changes. Well, it's not that it's not a functioning thing. We could say matter, uh, is, or energy is probably better, in terms of physics. Energy is a functioning thing, but it's always changing. It's always changing its form. But in and of itself, there's always energy. It doesn't. I mean, there's different. We'd say in classical physics anyway that energy doesn't come in and out of existence. The total amount of energy stays the same. But in any case, it's like one thing that's constantly changing its manifestations, but in and of itself, the nature of it doesn't change. So this is the nature of how the mind is. So this, whether you're confused or whether you're enlightened, it's the same basic substance. Now, substance again is a loaded word, but it's the same. Its way of existing doesn't change, and in some sense, that's beyond time. This is also that, as I've talked about, that time is itself an object of mind. It's a way of, it relies on experience. So there's something to change, it has to exist temporally. Now we can conventionally talk about the clear light mind of yesterday and today, because the nature of my mind yesterday, the nature of my mind today. But the clear light mind itself, I think it's not functioning at this coarse level where we experience time passing in a particular way that we usually do. Like we say kaleidoscope, periscope, periscopic existence. Like we just see one little piece of existence based on our little view of things. So it seems like things are constantly in motion and changing. But there's some level of experience that can experience things in a different way. So the understanding, at least in Tantra, is that we can access this mind, and actually it happens naturally. I mean, the main one is at death. So I find it very interesting that when people have near-death experiences, they talk about going towards the light. I really don't know if that's what they're talking about in terms of clear light mind, but it's interesting that there's some correspondence, because it's understood here that when you die, then the coarser minds gradually, become more and more aware, and then they become more and more aware. And then they become more and more aware, 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 and then they bec dissipate, and only the clear light mind is manifest. So then it's going beyond ordinary experience. So it's like, where did somebody go when they die? Is a bit of a, it's like the question isn't asked in the right way, because it's assuming that when the person dies, they're still experiencing this temporal existence that we're experiencing, and therefore there's some before and after and some place to go. So then within that experience, they haven't got anywhere, but at the same time, you can't say they don't exist anymore. So that's this very fundamental nature of mind that we get to naturally when the coarser mind ceases. So the reason you experience it at death is simply because there's no more coarse mind functioning. So it's all that's left. It's like when we dream, understanding here is that it's just experiencing a level of mind that was already there, but was too subtle to be, it was like kind of drowned out by our conscious thought day to day. But when that subsides, then we just experience a more basic level of mind, which is the dream state, which is already functioning now, but isn't, we're not consciously aware of it. So then beyond that, there's a deeper state. So if you go into deep sleep where there's no dreams, you're experiencing an even more fundamental nature of level of mind, although most of us are unconscious when that happens. But it's not in and of itself unconscious. It's just that our mind kind of blacks out. If you can, it's said that you can also use sleep state to experience a clear light mind, because if you can remain conscious and lucid, then you can get down to that. But the understanding here in Tantra is that this mind is much more powerful, because it's not limited by the concepts that we have, which kind of fragment the mind. It's more holistic, perhaps you could say. So if you can access that mind and use it to meditate, then you can make progress much more quickly. So this is really the distinction in Tantra, is that you're still meditating on emptiness, but rather than using a very coarse mind to do that, if you can use the fundamental mind to do that, then it will have a much deeper impact on your mind. You'll have much more profound change. Just like, we could use the analogy, I think is good, that someone has a near-death experience. Oftentimes they have profound changes in their life. It's like resetting your mind. All of a sudden, all of the thoughts and worries that they have, this whole momentum that they've been building up their entire life, that stops. It's like that they go beyond that, and they experience something beyond that. So it's a very powerful way to wake you up to your fundamental nature. Now, people who have near-death experiences are not necessarily enlightened because they can't sustain that. But in Tantra, it's part of the practice is basically to have what we would call a near-death experience, to induce that, not by harming your body, but simply because this is something that if someone who has a lot of concentration and has practiced yoga for a long time can control that. And so they can induce that experience and go beyond the idea of myself existing in this body in this way to a much more fundamental level of who I am. And then from that, recognize more deeply the truth about emptiness. So it's the truth of emptiness is not different, but what's different is the level of mind that's meditating on it. I hope this addressed your question.
Thank you, Andrew.
The lucid dreaming, that's a practice which is done by many people nowadays. There are books and there are regular classes.
Yeah.
So, but they are not. They don't have any religious background.
Right.
So how effective or how safe or how are they? Is it a healthy practice?
Whether it's safe, I can't comment. I would say you go at your own risk, because I haven't studied it enough. I have read some about it, but generally speaking, I think it's like anything, that this is the capacity that people have. It's actually been proven. There's Stephen LaBerge, you might know, is a scientist, who he kind of popularized this. And before him, lucid dreaming has been something people have done for a long time, but most scientists, or at least cognitive scientists, actually said that's not possible. They told people that they were deluded, because you can't have consciousness at the same time as you're in REM state. It's just, it's like there's two different. It's like the I am necessarily cancels out that you're consciously aware of what's happening. So he actually proved them wrong with a useful experiment. Maybe you know about this, I don't know, but he, because he was himself a very he trained himself in lucid dreaming. So he asked them, because when you're lucid dreaming, so you have your eye movement. So if you're lucid, you should be able to control your eyes. So he asked them, when I'm sleeping, so they hooked them up to all these sensors, ask me to turn my eyes to the left or right or something like that. And then they did, and he did that. So they knew that he could hear them and respond to them. So it was clear that even though they could tell he was in REM state by looking at his brain, that there was some control going on. So, based on this, a lot of people now have adopted this practice. And it could be very useful, I think. I mean, it could be a way that people gain a better understanding of their mind, more control over their mind. And it falls into with the practice of concentration. We could say we have the three higher trainings: ethical discipline, concentration, and wisdom. So concentration in and of itself, is not necessarily a path to enlightenment. So that's the question here. If somebody practices lucid dreaming without a foundation of ethical discipline, it might not be very helpful. Or even if they're doing it, but they don't have a right understanding and they don't use it to develop wisdom, it can just be a way of achieving, I'm so blissful in my dream. That's what a lot of people do when they do lucid dreamings. They just dream about all the most wonderful things they can and enjoy them. But that's ultimately not very useful because it's still a temporary experience. It doesn't last forever, doesn't free you from samsara. But if it can be used, because this is in Tantra, we have dream yoga. That's what I was mentioning, that if you can control your mind while you're sleeping, then it's possible to you access the clear light or to do other things, gain other powers that are useful on the path. So if you use it properly, it can be useful.
I guess in dream yoga, one is protected by the deities, and there is some kind of religious side to it, isn't it?
Well, yeah,
as opposed to
yeah. So I mean, to say whether it's dangerous, I should qualify that. I don't. A lot of the people who are doing it, they might be doing it in a safe way, but certainly it could be dangerous, because if you're, the understanding here is that when you're accessing the dream world, as you might say, this is a real world. It's not real in the same way that our waking existence is real, and actually our dream consciousness is considered a wrong consciousness because the things appear as real, but the appearance itself is a real thing. That's just a kind of almost like a tautology. It appears, so it must exist. So then to negate that and say, oh, it's totally non-existent is wrong. Then does it have any purpose? That's a different question. But here it's understood that this is actually a different level of mind. And some beings exist in this perpetually. Spirits, we would say, kind of exist in this dream world. That's how they exist that's how their entire life is that way. Whereas the humans only experience it when they shut off their coarse body, because our coarse body is much, more coarse. It's much stronger. It kind of drowns that level of mind out. So this is a different kind of existence where things exist in a very different way, where there's not this correspondence with physical matter, where everything has to follow particular physical laws. So it can be dangerous in and as much as you could make yourself crazy. It's just like people who meditate do that, or the understanding is that there are, as I said, spirits that exist in this realm. And if somebody isn't careful, they could get themselves possessed by a spirit. They could kind of make themselves vulnerable to entities that exist in that realm. So that's a concern. That's why in the Buddhist practice, they have all these different precautions like protector deities and all these things, which again, they don't exist outside of the dream world, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. We see like shamanism. This is a similar idea that if somebody who's a shaman, if they encounter a demon, then they make themselves into a bigger demon to stop the demon. Well, is that real? Well, it was effective, wasn't it? The demon the demon that saw you thought you were a real demon, so he was afraid and didn't harm you anymore. So it's just a matter of how much you can control your mind in some sense. But that's why it could be dangerous. And so as I say, I don't know any particular group or community that's practicing this. I can't speak for whether they're taking precautions or not. I don't know.
Because all this started with Carlos Castaneda and his dreaming and all those. I mean, I'm not into all this, so I just have some curiosity because I don't know what use it is, but it looks
similar.
like many people are doing it.
And the hippie culture, I mean, they, it's a similar thing where they're accessing things that might have a real existence, but for one thing, how they interpret it may or not be correct. I'm sure a lot of hippies, took drugs and then came up with some pretty wrong theories of how things exist. The Buddha said that specifically, that a very common wrong cause of wrong views is that people have some kind of real experience and then they make all kinds of extrapolations from that about how things exist. So that could happen. But for some people, it might be helpful. A lot of people, when they came to Kopan in the 1970s and became Lama Yeshe students, they said they were inspired by Carlos Castaneda or by taking LSD. So in some cases, it might actually, and Lama Yeshe even said that. He said, for some people, maybe it's good they take drugs. Not that I'm advocating that, because most of you are already interested in Buddhism. But for some people, it might actually get them out, show them that there's something beyond the material world. So what's happening when somebody takes drugs, the understanding here in Buddhism, at least, is that it's not that the drugs are creating an experience. What the drugs are doing is snuffing out your ordinary experience that's connected with your brain, because it's damaging your brain, essentially. So your mind no longer is so tied to your brain. So you experience things that can be experienced at a subtler level. And so those can be, they pretty trippy. But you don't have much control over it. And actually, the more you take drugs, according to tantric philosophy, it actually disturbs the wind channel energies of the body. So in the long run, as you see, somebody who's taken a lot of drugs, they can have mental disturbances or just have physical problems. They have physical stiffness and so forth, which is a sign of the wind channels not being very supple. So yeah, I wouldn't advocate it as a long-term path, but it is the case that for some people, this is how they access it. I don't think I said this before, but I think, I have found that there's a kind of a tendency in Western culture when people get involved in spirituality that they think that they no longer should apply reason, and that therefore it just has to be kind of, airy-fairy might be the word. Actually, when one of my teachers, he studied in America, he studied at Emory University with an exchange program. And he said that one of the physics professors pulled him and his friend aside, two monks, and said, you guys, I want to tell you something, because I know that you're interested in science, so I want to warn you, be really careful. All this airy fairy stuff, Buddhism, you don't have to believe that. You can. There's still time to get out of this. So that's kind of the assumption that if somebody's spiritual, then they're not using reason, and I think there's different reasons for that, why that assumption has come about. One of it is kind of the correlation or the association with hippies, and one of it I think may also be because a lot of us associate reason with materialism, as I talked about earlier. We assume that to be scientific and to be reasonable, you have to be materialist, and therefore if you want to be spiritual, you have to just stop thinking about things, because if you think about things, you're going to become a materialist. Or that, it's like our way of reasoning leads us to that. So rather than trying to negate that with reason, we just stop reasoning. But it's possible to approach these things using reasoning and using the same approach that I talked about earlier with the boats. Like you have a hypothesis and you try this. You say, okay, lucid dreaming, rather than just abandoning all reason and just do this and have a great experience, test this out as a scientist would, and use an approach where, okay, this is what I now know. Can I build on that and gain further knowledge and have a more coherent picture of how things are based on that, and never get to the point where we just say, I'm not going to I'm not going to have a system of understanding. You always have to have that basis. You have to be very careful with that. But yeah, within that, this is another approach. Just like a microscope helps us to see things that we can't usually see with a normal everyday eye, then lucid dreaming or other forms of manipulating our subtle consciousness give us a different way of experiencing the world and subtler things that we can't see with our sense consciousness. Okay. All right. Well, maybe let's do the prayers now. It's almost 1:30. Tomorrow, as I say, I think that tomorrow will be the last day. But if for example, if we finish tomorrow and there's not time for questions, we could even have one more session next weekend with just questions and answers. So don't feel if you have any other questions, or of course, as always, you can write in. So let's do the closing prayers. May the precious supreme bodhicitta not yet born arise. May that arisen not decline, but increase more and more. Samsara and nirvana lack even an atom of inherent existence, and cause and effect independent arising are betraying. I seek your blessings to discern the meaning of Nagarjuna's thought that these two are mutually complementary, not contradictory. However many sick sentient beings there are, may they quickly be freed from all sicknesses. May all sicknesses without exception of transmigratory beings never occur again. In all my lives, never separated from pure gurus, may I enjoy the magnificent Dharma, and by completing the qualities, the grounds and paths, may I quickly attain the state of Vajradhara. By the force of the victorious one, Tsongkhapa acting as my direct Maha and a virtuous friend in all my lives, may I never turn away for even a second from the pure path highly admired by the victorious one. May I and all sentient beings meet the teachings of the victorious one, Losung Dragpa, who lived an eminent life endowed with pure morality, a brave heart in doing the Bodhisattva's extensive deeds, and the yoga of the two stages, supreme transcendental wisdom of non-dual bliss and voidness. Like the earth, water, fire, and wind, medicines in the wood and the forest, may always be enjoyed by all sentient beings as they like and without resistance. May I hold sentient beings as dear as my life. May sentient beings hold me most dear. May all their negative karma ripen on me, and may all my virtue ripen on them. As long as any sentient being has not been liberated from samsara, may I abide in samsara to help them, even though I achieve highest enlightenment. May I become like a wish-granting jewel, fulfilling all the wishes, and like a wish-granting tree, fulfilling all the hopes of transmigratory beings. By merely seeing, hearing, thinking, or remembering me, as well as by touching or by talking to me, may all sufferings instantly be pacified, and may there be happiness forever. Due to all the past, present, and future merits collected by me, the numberless Buddhas, the numberless sentient beings, which are completely empty of existing from their own side, may I, who completely empty of existing from my own side, heed the state of full enlightenment, which is completely empty of existing from its own side. May all sentient beings who are completely empty of existing from their own side, to that state which is completely empty of existing from its own side, or myself alone, who am completely empty of existing from my own side. I fully dedicate all these virtues to be able to train, just like the hero Manjushri, who knows reality as it is, reality, and just like Samantabhadra as well. I fully dedicate all my roots of virtue, the dedication praises best, by the victorious ones thus gone to 3 times, that might perform good works. Good conduct. For the Dharma, King Tsongkhapa's way of Dharma to flourish, may all signs of obstacles be pacified, and all conducive conditions be complete. Due to the 2 types of merit of the 3 times of myself and others, may the teachings of the victorious one, Losung Dragpa, shine resplendent forever. Incomparably kind and supreme Tenzin Gache, the wish-fulfilling jewel. May you have a long life and all your wishes be spontaneously, all wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Nagarjuna's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the 3 sublime ones, savor of myself and others, your disciples, please live long. Okay, so thank you, everybody. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.